On April 12, 1985, the Federal Communications Commission rejected a request from Massachusetts-based group Action for Children's Television. The request was to ban shows starring toys such as Papa Smurf and Strawberry Shortcake, arguing that children were being barraged with what is essentially a commercial for the toys featured in the program. James C. McKinney of the FCC explained that without advertising, children's shows on commercial television might not exist, so there was nothing wrong with broadcasting shows with characters that are also toys. This is just one of many attempts to get the FCC to ban these program-length commercials.
You're right. It was a controversial topic, and let me just state up front my feelings on this whole thing is, if creative people at Disney or Hanna-Barbera come up with characters and make a television show, that's great. But why is it any different than creative people at Mattel or at Sega coming up with a character and storylines? Because, by the way, most great toys have a great story behind them. Even Barbie, it's a fantastic story. I mean, this is this teenage fashion model girl originally named Barbara Millicent Roberts, who has this group of friends, and they live in Los Angeles, and they do all these things that teenagers in Los Angeles do. So even Barbie, there's an immense amount of backstory to it. And so with He-Man and Masters of the Universe, when the guys at Mattel created it, they presented it as a story. Here's He-Man. He's going to be Prince Adam, and when he raises his sword and says, "I have the power," he's going to turn into the strongest man in the universe. And he has his sidekicks. He had his Battle Cat, and he had his other friends. And their thing was to defend Eternia, and their main enemy was this guy Skeletor, who tried to live in Castle Grayskull. And he had his group of enemy characters. So the whole thing, from its very beginning, was a story. It was presented as a story, and I remember it very, very well, and the people who developed it. So my point is, what's the difference between great creative people at Disney creating a story that becomes a television show or a movie, to the difference between it coming out of a toy company with creative people? Because we certainly had a lot of creative people and still do at Mattel.
In 1969, ABC aired Hot Wheels, a 30-minute Saturday morning cartoon primarily sponsored by Mattel Toys. The show would have faded into obscurity if not for the FCC action during the show's broadcast. After receiving complaints from homes and rival toy companies that the show was a 30-minute advertisement, they ordered the station to log part of the show as advertising time. Action for Children's Television was a non-profit child advocacy group focused on improving the quality of children's television and discouraging over-commercialization of young viewers. ACT's original target was the Boston edition of the children's show Romper Room. Romper Room was a series franchised and syndicated, allowing local affiliates to produce their own version of the show rather than the national telecast. ACT targeted the Boston version of Romper Room at WHDH-TV for focusing on promoting its branded toy line to their kindergarten-aged viewers. ACT threatened with a referral to the FCC, and WHDH phased out any host selling in the broadcast. Later, the ACT targeted Saturday morning cartoons involving violence and petitioning to ban advertising on all programs for children. A program-length commercial as described by the University of Oregon's Communication Law Resource regarding the 1990 FCC proposal is a program associated with a product in which commercials for that product are aired.
I grew up with television where the host would actually sell me milk in the commercial breaks. Even, look, Lord love him, even Bob Keeshan is Captain Kangaroo and Shari Lewis. The show would go off and the commercial time would come on, and there they were going, "Hey kids, let's drink this." So that kind of host selling was okay in the early days, but I think people realized had a negative and undue influence on young children.
There were things happening in animation at that time that were very new, that we had never really seen before. And what happened was, a couple years before that, in the very late 70s, a competitor to Hallmark came up with a character called Strawberry Shortcake. And Strawberry Shortcake was either an animated special or an animated series, I think in the late 70s. And it was produced by American Greetings, which was the main competitor to Hallmark Cards. They were out of Cleveland. And it was such a big hit. It was so successful for the company that everybody started to reassess what animation could be. For example, does it do original properties, do original shows and characters and all that have to originate, have to start in an animation studio? Why can't, like people within these corporate entities develop their own properties and then hire these animation studios to produce them for them?
Riddle me this. Was there really that big a difference between that spate of shows in the 70s that we railed against and the ones that replaced them, which was, shows like Scooby-Doo. There's Scooby snacks and Scooby t-shirts and Scooby games and Scooby plush. And so the difference is that the folks who created Scooby-Doo created a great set of characters and great adventures. And the play stuff came afterwards. What Peggy was mad about is these were toy companies who had toys that maybe weren't moving off the shelf, and they thought, great, instead of a minute-long commercial, and that's how long commercials were in those days, let's do 22 minutes of a thing. And she was like, okay, but label it as a commercial.
To me, it doesn't matter where it's created. If it's a good enough story to warrant getting on air, and the ratings certainly showed that it was a good enough story because it did very, very well in ratings. That's not the point. Isn't where was it created? The point is it good? Is it good material? Do people want to watch it or not?
One of the concerns and the challenge with that was the FCC, the government, was always looking over the shoulder of the producers and the networks to make sure the show wasn't a commercial for the toy. So there were some stipulations, like if a show was based on a toy. I'm going to give you an example of a show called Brave Star, done in the 70s, I believe, 70s, early 80s, done by Filmation. And I believe the rule was if your show was based on a toy, the commercial could not run within the body of the show, because it would seem like the whole show was a commercial for the toy. From a creative point of view, it really meant nothing to us because we dealt with the world that the toy was created for. The toy was in reality with what kids played with, but Filmation did a lot of shows based on toys or that spun out of toys. I think the most shameless show I worked on that was based on a toy was Street Sharks. It was just god awful. It was the worst thing I've ever done. I just knew my career had hit a rock. I won't say rock bottom, but it was a rock because it was all about get this show on the air, and Mattel, who created Street Sharks, was selling a ton of these things. It was all about the work, and the more shows produced, the better we ate.
So we have this toy line, He-Man Masters of the Universe. I think it must have been 1983, 82. And it's selling very well. There's no television show. It's selling very, very well at retail. And we were doing about $75 million in revenue on it. And I was president of the company by then. And the chairman of the company comes into my office one day and he says, well, it's nice you've got this $75 million brand that you guys created. But, it can never be anything like Star Wars because you don't have a movie or a television show and you can't get one. And I took that as a threat or a challenge. And so I said, do you want to bet? And that's how I ended up contacting, as a kind of a long about Ray, I contacted a guy who had been at our advertising agency at Ogilvy and Mather, and he introduced me to Lou Scheimer, head of Filmation. And that was how we got together with Filmation.
Filmation had done, in 1981, they had done a commercial for Mattel for this new line of toys that came out called the He-Man and Masters of the Universe. The commercial came out great, really good. It was like really, really different. It was like fully animated stuff. It was really different for the time. It made a big impact, and toy sales just shot through the roof because of it. They made a deal with Mattel to do an animated, to do a series based on this toy line.
Now, frankly, I will tell you, I never expected that we would make any money back off of the television show. That was a complete surprise to us. and we were, I think, the first ones to come up with the idea of, instead of trying to sell it to the television stations, we would give it away free. In return, they would give us advertising time. And the advertising time, by the rules that existed back then, we couldn't advertise He-Man and Masters of the Universe on those television shows, but we could advertise Hot Wheels. On the other hand, we could also sell them. And that's what we ended up doing. We ended up selling a lot of them to McDonald's, to Nike, to different children's companies, the companies that were interested in the children's audience. And to our amazement, the show rated so well, it did so well, that we got money back for those spots, to the tune of it actually paid us for the entire production of the television shows. So we ended up making a profit off of the TV advertising spots, and of course, having the television show on air. I can't deny that it certainly helped sales. Sales went up as well. So we were getting revenue back from the advertising spots, and we were getting increased revenue from the sale of the toys in the He-Man and Masters of the Universe product line.
The thing that where I was initially confronted with this whole new way of doing things, was the day that they brought in a couple boxes of these toys from Mattel. And we had a skeleton crew over at Filmation, and they gathered us around. It was just a very small handful of people. And they said, okay, this is the next cartoon we're doing, guys. This is it. And they pulled out the He-Man doll, and they pulled out Skeletor, and they pulled out all these different characters. And they said, and they pulled out the vehicles. And we started that series from that moment on, when they brought the toys over from Mattel. And that's where it became a struggle for me, because for one thing, I didn't get into animation to do this, and I wanted to do original stuff, and I didn't feel that these characters, these toys that we were getting, were conducive to animation. They were they were good toys, they were fun toys, but just because something is a toy doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be able to transition effectively to animation, to what you need to do in order to bring a character to life and to move it and to do it, in a really appealing and efficient manner. So it was a difficult thing for me, and I wasn't the only one. A lot of artists over time really started to feel, it was very stifling.
There were those series that Action for Children's Television in the 1970s and then into the 1980s railed against, such as He-Man and Master of the Universe, some of those other shows that began as toys and then found an expanded life in media. No, I never worked on any of those shows. That said, with rare exception, I don't think there is a children's television program that was ever made where somebody didn't think about the consumer products angle and consult consumer products experts and play experts as to how to craft the television program so that it would encourage children's play after the fact. There's a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, saying or sort of wisdom in kids' television that a very successful television program makes kids say two things. They say, I want to go to that kid's house and play, which means they want to watch the screens-based adventure. They want to play with those characters in that show. But in order for the show to be really successful, kids also have to say, and I want that kid to come to my house, which means I want the toys and the lunchbox and the sheets and the transfers and everything else. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think when you look at what Action for Children's Television was trying to do in the 1970s that led to the passing of, eventually in 1990, of the Children's Television Act, was less about canceling the connection between children's play with action figures or games or puzzles or anything else than it was about how those television programs were crafted to begin with. And I think the other thing that gets forgotten is that that sort of regulatory fervor in the 70s and into the 80s was as much about violence on television as it was about commercials on television. So that what content are we showing our kids? And we've got a 50, 60-year history of research on the impact of screens-based media on children's learning and development, we still can't make a decision. Is it the content? Is it the amount of time they're watching? Is it the commercial this is longitudinal research that eventually we may come to some conclusions. But what we do know is that when children are a certain age, they don't question things. If somebody tells them something, well, very nice man on TV told me that, so it must be true.
And Action for Children's Television, I heard people have positive and negative things that they say about it, but I would say that in that instance, they made a very positive, and it was very positive what they did. It was really, really necessary what they did. It was just out of control.
I mean, I understand the concerns, the FCC and educational. Again, there was such a filter for animation at that time. You had educators looking at it, and they were doing horrible things, trying to take. In their minds, they're trying to protect children from violence, from sex, but mainly violence, because they would look at the old Roadrunner cartoons, the Bugs Bunny, the Warner cartoons, Tom and Jerry, where those guys beat each other up for 6 minutes, and it was funny.
They were funny and they were action-packed, and in a lot of, I don't want to say in all, but in a lot of cases, when parents say or grown-ups say, well, that's a great kids' TV show, they're looking at it from a grown-up perspective, not from a kid's perspective. As much as we think we remember who we were when we were 10, we don't. If you think about the business from a slightly broader historical perspective, everyone's always been mad at children's television. Kids were running out of school or running away from their chores to go watch, action-packed Western adventures with, folks doing pratfalls and shooting each other in barrels. The first legislation around children's television was actually around radio. All of a sudden, kids weren't only playing outside. They were lying on the living room rug with their hands and, with their faces in their hands, staring at a big radio set and listening to The Shadow or other dramas, or Little Orphan Annie. And so then that was the first legislation. Then there was legislation. There was, anger in the 1950s when radio moved to television, and then again when television moved to a computer. So this has been over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century.
There were these hearings in Washington, D.C. They were going on dealing with re-regulating children's television content, because it was deregulated in about 84, I think, that allowed this whole thing to happen. And really things were getting just so out of control that it was just like, everything that was on television by this time was just toys, 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 And I felt strongly because I felt like the American family was being cheated by this. You're not getting the kind of entertainment that I got when I was a kid. This is wrong. This is really wrong.
We're trying to protect our kids because kids can't tell the difference in many cases between content and when someone is trying to sell them something. And I think that's what Action for Children's Television was about, was like, let's be clear.
And a lot of times people ask me, well, I really like those cartoons from the 80s. I really like them. I said, yeah, well, we did the best we could with what we had. We really did. But, imagine how much better they would have been if we had more creative control, where it didn't come down to appeasing the head of the studio or finding something that would be like within it, like they won't get this. So, everything was just like being dumbed down,
It would just be like, wow, we can't do what? We can't say this, we can't do that. Program length shows or commercials, yeah, absolutely. Some of them, a great many, were guilty of that.
I think there's a real difference between who Peggy Charon was and what she wanted to accomplish and what she did accomplish with the Children's Television Act. Then the more, and the kindest word I can use is Luddite advocacy groups who seriously want to cancel children's media. They want to go back to an era that they think was purer. Peggy just wanted good kids' TV. She thought kids deserved as diverse a palette of children's media as grown-ups. And she was pissed that kids were just getting this narrow slice of TV because that's what people thought they could build a business on. She wasn't against business. She wasn't against people making money. She just wanted kids to have a diversity of content.
The whole nature changed. It went from finding a compromise, finding some middle ground, to you will voluntarily, telling Hollywood, you will voluntarily re-regulate children's television or we will do it for you. And what happened as a result of that was legislation was passed called the Children's Television Act of 1990, and that changed the entire nature of animation for television.
The Children's Television Act of 1990 prescribed the FCC to detail the standards for commercial television broadcast licensees, limiting the amount of advertising in children's programs per hour.
So that I think the regulatory framework we saw get put in place in the, over the course of the late 80s and then formalized in 1990 was protectionist in inspiration and was designed to create an industry that understood children's developmental needs, but yet allowed an industry to flourish.
And that cleared the way for everything. That opened everything up. And that's how we started getting the animation boom of the 90s. That was a big, big factor in it. That's why you got like Batman, WB's Batman, and Ren and Stimpy, and Dexter's Lab, and Animaniacs. And all those great cartoons of the 90s that weren't tied into toys, It was just like we had freedom. And it opened everything up. So, here come the 90s and bam, it was just all positive things happened as a result of that.
For one thing, anime came over here and just kicked everything's butt that we were doing. And it wasn't based on any toys. It may, a toy or a card game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something may come after that or with it, but I think the Japanese had a real influence on storytelling, and they still do. And then live action directors coming in, Beavis and Butthead, Family Guy, the primetime type of shows. They just began to see that they could paint with a broader palette than just toy-driven shows, action shows, comedy shows.
We're really far from being done, that this is an ongoing process, and that by carving out this slice of, say, 1975 to 1990, when the advocacy first began, it hit the Reagan administration, and culminated in the passage of the Children's Television Act. It's a fascinating 15-year slice, but to acknowledge that it's a slice, that happened because of what happened in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. We're about to step into really deep water again with a streaming environment that has magnified the amount of content by like a billion. When you think about the fact that the children's television business in the U.S. started as Saturday morning television, kids' TV was on from 7 o'clock in the morning when the test pattern went off till like noon. Now there is no such thing as, there's channels and stream. It's so much more. So we went from, serving a meal to being this, kind of 24-hour buffet.
I think that the biggest lesson is to appreciate what we have today. Appreciate, that was a fun era. That was a fun time. It was great to be around in those days. Even though I may be vocalizing a lot of my frustrations from the time, I think the positives still overweigh whatever kind of negatives we were personally dealing with.
Well, I think also there are a lot of good educational content coming out of the toy companies. Obviously, Leapfrog was a significant one. We did a number of DVDs based on the Leapfrog characters that did very well, were very popular, sold very well at retail, and were very educational. I mean, they taught kids a lot of stuff. I remember one teacher telling me that the combination of this product we had with that stuck to your refrigerator and taught the ABCs. She said that plus the DVD on the Leapfrog characters was the best way for kids to start learning how to read that she had come across. So that was, we did it, and of course Hasbro had done it for years with Romper Room and Romper Room educational television shows. Lego has been very involved, and so there's been a lot of really good stuff that's come out of the toy industry creativity that has been positive and educational that I don't think the industry gets enough credit for.